The movie starts off with Frank Abagnale Sr. giving a speech at his Rotary Club in New Rochelle in NYC. His son, Frank Abagnale Jr., and his French wife, Paula, are both there proud of him. The following morning, Frank Sr. wakes Frank Jr. up from his sleep, asking him if he has a black suit and telling him that he doesn't even have to go to school today. They visit a store before its opening time. Then Frank Sr. lies and says that there's been a sudden death in the family. His own father has passed away, and his son desperately needs a black suit. The lady who works there, Darcy, refuses to help them because they haven't opened yet. Frank Sr. pulls out a beautiful necklace and asks Darcy if it's hers, and he then says that he found it in the parking lot, and it must have slipped right off her neck. This tactic seems to work because later we see Frank Jr. wearing a black suit after all. Frank Sr. tells his son that he should get out the car and open it for him, and while he goes into the bank, Frank should stay in the car no matter what, even if there's a chance of getting ticketed, basically teaching him how to pretend to be a chauffeur for someone wealthy. Frank tries getting a loan from the bank because he's in deep debt, and is being investigated for tax fraud. But the bank teller refuses to help him get a loan because he's not even a client of theirs and he's also in trouble with the IRS. Because he was unable to get the loan, he has to sell his car and their house and move into a much smaller apartment. On his 16th birthday, his dad gifts Frank a checkbook and tells him that from that day he's a part of their little club. On Frank's first day at a new school, he gets intentionally knocked into by a football player named Brad. When he gets to his class, he sees that Brad is in his class. Then he goes over to the board and writes down his surname pretending to be a substitute teacher, and Brad is embarrassed to have treated a sub badly. Frank asks the class where they last left off, then asks Brad to go in front of the class and read the next passage for them. Then the actual substitute teacher shows up and is mad because Frank is already there as a substitute, and they made her travel all that distance for nothing, knowing very well she's an old woman. Later in the week, the principal of the school has a meeting with Frank's parents to let them know that Frank Jr. has been teaching his class, has been issuing our homework, even hosted a parent-teacher meeting, and has been planning a class trip to a local factory. Paula and Frank, especially Paula, are mortified after hearing this. While waiting for his parents, there's a student who tells the worker that she has a sick note from her mom and she'll be leaving soon. Then Frank tells her to fold it in half because when parents give us sick notes, we usually fold them in half and put them in our pockets, so if she wants it to seem more believable, she should fold the note, and she listens to him. Paula doesn't talk to Frank when they get out of the principal's office, but Frank Sr. starts laughing along with Frank Jr. because he can see that his son is taking after him, and he's doing it well. A few days later, when Frank comes home from school, he finds his mom and his dad's friend Jack Barnes from the Rotary Club together in his parents' bedroom. But Paula says that Jack was looking for his dad and she decided to give him a tour of the house. But of course, Frank, being 16 and not an idiot, he doesn't believe this story at all. Paula asks Frank if he's going to tell his dad, but he says she's not going to. Then Paula has the nerve to say that of course he won't tell him anything because there's nothing to tell him. Days after that, Frank comes back home to find Dick Kessner, who tells him to come to his parents' bedroom, where he finds his French grandma, who he hasn't seen in years, and a social worker. Paula tells him that they're getting a divorce, and the social worker asks him to write down one of his parents' name that he'd like to live with after the divorce. Frank decides to run away. He writes a check to get a ticket to leave his hometown. At midnight, while at a hotel, he gets kicked out because his checks have bounced. Then Frank says that the bank is the one who made a mistake. After being kicked out, he gets the idea to change his date of birth to make it seem like he's 10 years older than he is, and proceeds to change his surname from Abagnale to Taylor on the checks. While at a bank trying to cash the check, he gets told that banks aren't allowed to cash checks from other banks. Then he asks the lady what her name is. Then he proceeds to pull his dad's necklace trick word for word. But when he tries to show her the necklace, he finds a man in the lady's seat instead, and his plan is ruined. He tries cashing the checks at other banks, pretending to need to buy books for school, birthday gifts for grandparents, and needing money for medicine, but they all refuse because they can't cash out checks from people who aren't their clients. After all the rejections, he's walking and sees a pilot getting out of a cab with multiple female flight attendants, and he's mesmerized by this. Frank shows up to the Pan American Airways headquarters and introduces himself to the receptionist as Frank Black from a nearby high school, and he'll be meeting Mr. Morgan because he's the one who'll be writing the article for his school's paper. He meets Mr. Morgan and proceeds to ask him various questions about what a person needs to do or have to be an official pilot. Mr. Morgan gives Frank his FAA license that has been expired for 3 years. Frank then asks him if he can also have an old ID badge of his, but he says that he can't give him one because the only way to get one is to become an official pilot himself for Pan American Airlines. Days later, he's at a payphone calling Pan American Airways pretending to be a co-pilot based in San Francisco, and he says that he had sent his uniform to be cleaned through the hotel, but it appears to have been lost, and the lady on the other end directs him to their uniform supplier and tells him that he'll let the tailor know that Frank's on his way, making the process so much easier for him. When it's time to pay, he offers to give him a check, but the tailor says that they don't take cash or checks. He just has to put in his pilot ID and the company will bill Pan Am and it'll be deducted from his next paycheck. And Frank is happy to hear about this. Frank's uniform definitely does the job because while he's walking, everyone's staring and mesmerized by him. This uniform works exceptionally well that he's now able to cash out his checks without any hassles, and that one clerk in the beginning doesn't even recognize him and even thanks Frank for choosing their bank. He's able to stay in luxury hotels a lot easier just because of the uniform. Just goes to show how humans really perceive outer appearance with trustworthiness. He writes to his dad about being accepted into the company's training program. And he also asks his dad to go to his old high school and apologize to Joanna about him not being able to take her to the junior prom. So during this time, he's literally 16 years old, turning 17 that year. Anyways, Frank uses a typewriter to forge new checks, but now he soaks a Pan American toy airplane in the bathtub, then gets the sticker from its tail and sticks it onto the new check. Then he puts the check into the Holy Bible. While the lady at the bank is checking its legitimacy, Frank distracts her by showering her with a compliment about her eyes, and it works, and he's able to cash the check. He realizes that this is a great idea, and gets multiple Pan Am toy airplanes into the bathtub and takes the stickers out and places them onto numerous new checks. Frank learns from the hotel manager that he can cash out checks at the airport and the airline is the one who takes care of it. Then Frank is on his way to the airport. When he's cashing out his check, the lady asks him if he's the deadhead for the flight out, and he says yes. Deadhead pilots are used by airlines for repositioning or rescheduling flights, without actively flying. And they basically also enjoy benefits like relaxed duty and free boarding. One of the flight attendants introduces him to the pilots in the cockpit, and because of his interview with Mr. Morgan, he's able to answer all the questions that the pilots ask him with ease. He writes to his dad telling him that his family can also fly for free, and asks his dad to tell his mom that he's got 2 first-class tickets to Hawaii for Christmas. Frank uses the necklace trick again on one of the flight attendants, and she of course falls for it, and they have intercourse once the plane has landed. Days later, he visits a bank and flirts with the clerk and asks her out for a steak dinner. He then asks her a bunch of questions about how checks work, and he learns that they put the checks into the Micker machine that uses a special ink to encode the account numbers on the bottom of the check, also where these numbers are placed on checks, and that they're called routing numbers, but she doesn't exactly know where the numbers are routed to. Frank attends an auction, and he bids on a Micker machine. Meanwhile, at the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., Carl Handrati is talking to his team about an unknown individual that's opening checking accounts at various banks, then changing the Micker routing number at the bottom of the checks. Carl explains to his team that every state has a specific number that it corresponds with. For example, New York is 02, so if it's then changed to 12 where it's actually cashed out, it'll go to the San Francisco Federal Branch, which in turn helps him stay longer in a state, as the bank doesn't notice that his checks have bounced. Frank meets up with his dad at a fancy restaurant and tells him all about his new life and how he bought a new convertible Cadillac and he's giving it to him. But Frank Sr. says he can't take it because bad things would happen if the IRS found out he was driving a brand new convertible. Frank Sr. tells him that he also closed down their family business before the IRS did, because they've been threatening to take it from him. Carl Handrati and his team locate Frank to a resort hotel in Los Angeles, where they get their hands on a check that Frank has used to pay with, and the owner asks Carl and his team not to disturb his guest, meaning he's still at the resort. He gives them Frank's room number. Then Carl is on his way. When he gets into Frank's room, he finds it empty and dirty with potato chips on the floor and the Micker machine he uses to write his checks. Then he hears someone flush the toilet and obviously assumes it's the guilty party, and it is. But Frank gets out of the bathroom acting in a very serious manner and says that his name is Allen, Barry Allen, and he's a part of the Secret Service, as the FBI aren't the only ones who were after Frank. He tells Carl that his partner has the criminal in custody and is taking him to the car. Carl asks him for his ID, and he gives him, but right before Carl's about to open his wallet to verify his identity, he points towards the window to show him the young man that's supposedly his partner, and the old man that's the criminal. But in reality, Frank knows that the young man, Murph, is helping the older man because he recently got his knee hurt and needs assistance. He shouts to Murph to call the LAPD because he doesn't want any more people walking into his crime scenes. Frank also asks for his ID and finds out that his name is Carl Handrati. Frank tells Carl that he'll be taking the evidence downstairs to avoid any staff walking into the crime scene, and he'll be right back to get Carl so that he can talk to the suspect. Before he leaves, Carl tells him he's forgetting his wallet, and Frank says that he'll be right back, and he totally trusts that Carl won't do anything with his ID. Of course, Carl buys this whole story and actually waits for Frank to come back from putting away the evidence, and he's actually very happy and proud that they've stopped this criminal, once and for all. After a while of waiting, he starts getting the thought of looking through his wallet, and when he opens it, he finds the labels of food has been removed and placed inside the wallet. He runs to the window to see Frank running away with the Micker machine, and he's frustrated that he got fooled so easily. Back at the FBI headquarters, Carl gets laughed at by his boss and partners for being so easily manipulated. His boss then tells him to make sure that Frank doesn't humiliate him, but he says that he can't because he heard his voice and saw his face, so he'll definitely be catching him soon. While hanging out with Mr. Morgan, Frank is told that Pan American officials are going mad because there's a person pretending to be a Pan Am pilot. Mr. Morgan then refers to him as the James Bond of the sky. Hearing this statement fascinates him, and he ends up at the movie theater watching a James Bond movie. He even goes to a tailor to get the exact suit that James Bond wore in the movie. On Christmas Eve, while working on finding Frank, Carl gets a phone call from Barry Allen. Barry Allen tells Carl that he wants to apologize to him, but Carl says that no, Barry can't apologize to him. He tells him that if he really wants to apologize, then they should meet face to face. Barry agrees and tells him his room number, but that tomorrow morning he'll be on his way. Carl laughs at Frank because he clearly had no one to call on Christmas Eve, which is the real reason he called Carl, and not because he wanted to apologize to him. Frank hangs up abruptly as it seems Carl is correct. While at a cafe, he gets his cup refilled by a waiter that notices all the circled Barry Allens and asks him if he's a collector. Carl is confused about what he's talking about. Then he says Barry Allen, aka The Flash, the comic book character. Carl puts two and two together and realizes that their suspect is a teenage boy. And it all makes sense to him why he doesn't have a record, or why they couldn't match his fingerprints either. He tells his partner to contact the NYPD to get all the teenage runaways, and he says he's 100% sure he's from New York, because Frank used a Yankees analogy to explain how he knew Carl wouldn't look inside his wallet. We see that Carl and his team show up to Paula's new house. When inside, she tells them that she grew up in a very small village in France called Mount Richard, the kind that didn't know who Sarah Lee was. She further tells them that's where she met Frank's dad. Carl asks Paul if she has a picture of Frank, then she shows them Frank's old high school yearbook photo. As soon as Carl sees the picture, he knows that Frank is their guy. Before they leave, Carl tells Paula that her son is forging checks, and Paula offers to write Carl a check for the amount he owes, but Carl tells him that Frank's current balance is $1.3 million, and she's distraught and freezes when she hears the amount. Frank is now in Atlanta, Georgia, and it seems he works at managing an apartment building, because he's telling the people partying how to be cleaner, like using coasters. Then we see him at a hospital, and notices a hospital nurse named Brenda being shouted at by a doctor. When she gets back to her station, she's crying. Then Frank tries lifting her spirits up by praising her when she's able to tell Frank the status of his friend, who's currently in the hospital for a fractured ankle. Frank tells Brenda that he likes her braces. Then she says that they're alright. He further lies and says that he took his off last year and his were bottoms. Brenda then compliments him by saying that he's got nice teeth. He asks Brenda if the hospital is hiring, and she says she doesn't know, but what would he like to do? Then he says that he's a doctor. When he gets home, he starts forging a medical degree certificate from Harvard Medical School, also changing his surname to Connors, stating that he was top of his class. Frank is told that the only position available is an emergency room supervisor for the midnight to 8 a.m. shift, supervising 6 interns and 20 nurses. Frank takes the job only if he's able to choose his own nurses. Frank goes home and watches surgeons performing surgery. To know more about the analogies they use, Brenda goes to Frank's office and shows her that she got her braces off, and they end up making out. While they're making out, Frank gets paged to the emergency room, and he finds a boy that's badly injured after falling off his bicycle. Because Frank has zero knowledge about emergency pediatric medicine, he asks one of the intern doctors what he thinks should be done, and he says they should get a CT scan, clean up the blood and get his wound stitched, and put him in a walking cast. He leaves because they don't need Frank, as they know what to do, and Frank goes into the janitor's closet and he vomits. Carl pays Frank Sr. a visit, and he immediately thinks that Carl's there to arrest him for his issues with the IRS. But Carl tells him he's here for his son and asks him if he knows where Frank is. Frank Sr. lies and says that Frank has sneakily got into the army and is fighting for other countries. Carl realizes that Frank Sr. isn't going to be of any help, and when he goes to put his number on the table, he spots a letter from Frank that he sent to his dad recently, and he writes down the address. Meanwhile, Brenda is crying, confessing to Frank that she doesn't want him to judge her, but she had an abortion and her parents got so angry at her that they kicked her out of their house and told her that she wasn't their daughter anymore. Frank asks Brenda that if she were engaged to a doctor, would that change their minds? He says that he'll go to her parents and ask for their permission to marry her. Carl and his team show up to the apartment building he was recently in, but they don't find anyone, except his fake Harvard medical certificate. Frank goes to Brenda's parents' house and the whole family believes that he's Lutheran as well as a doctor. During the dinner, he learns that Brenda's dad is an attorney, so he lies and says that before he went to medical school, he passed the bar in California and even practiced law for a year, then suddenly decided to try pediatrics. He further lies and says he went to UC Berkeley, which is the university that Brenda's dad went to as well. Brenda's dad asks him if a professor that was a horrible person still worked there when he was there, and he says that he most certainly was. He doesn't stop there and asks Frank what the name of his beloved dog was, but of course he has no idea who they're even talking about. So he lies and says that the dog actually died. While this is happening, Carl and the FBI raid the hospital looking for Frank, but only find his Micker machine. Brenda's dad gives Frank his blessing and helps Frank get a chance to write the Louisiana State Bar exam, which he passes. He gets a job as an assistant prosecutor for Brenda's dad's law firm. Frank really took the saying, "You can do everything you want in life as long as you believe in yourself," a little too seriously. He again watches TV, but this time about lawyers in court so that he can practice. Frank surprises his dad and tells him that he's going to be getting a $60,000 house, and he's going to get everything the government took from their family back, the cars and clothes, everything. He gives his dad coins to use on the payphone to call up his mom to tell him that he's got 2 first-class tickets. But he's told by his dad that Paula is now married to Jack Barnes, the same man who she was having an affair with back when they were a family, and they even have a house in Long Island together. Frank Sr. tells him that they're never going to catch him, but Frank Jr. asks his dad to ask him to stop, but Frank Sr. says that he can't stop. It's Christmas Eve, and again Frank calls Carl. But this time he asks Carl to stop following him, because he's met someone who he really loves wholeheartedly and will be getting married to. And he just wants this whole thing to stop and be over. Carl then assumes that it's because he's closing in on Frank, and that's why he's asking him to stop. But Carl tells Frank that their whole situation will only ever stop once Frank is caught and locked up. When Frank hangs up, Carl tells his team to search all newspapers about any engagements to a Frank Connors, but his partner says that Frank has probably changed his surname by now. But Carl says he's definitely not changed it because whoever he's marrying knows Frank as Connors. Carl and his partners manage to locate Frank at his own engagement party. Frank sees them and runs to get his suitcase. Frank comes clean to Brenda that he isn't a doctor, never went to medical school, isn't Lutheran, that he ran away from home a year and a half ago when he was 16, and has never practiced law until recently at her father's law firm. He shows Brenda 2 suitcases with thousands and thousands of dollars, and he tells her that there's enough money for the both of them for a whole lifetime, and they can both disappear and go live their lives together somewhere else. Brenda is distraught because she basically fell in love with a teenage boy, who lied to her about everything about himself. As he's about to escape through the window, Frank tells Brenda to meet him in 2 days at the Miami International Airport, and she shouldn't tell anyone about this, and all Brenda says to him is, "What is your name?" Frank Abagnale Jr. Meanwhile, Carl is downstairs and sees that one of the wine bottles' label has been removed, and this is confirmation that he's at the right place. When he gets to Brenda and Frank's room, he just finds a shocked Brenda leaning against the wall. 2 days later, Frank is at the airport waiting for Brenda. We see that she actually did show up, and Frank is very happy to see her. When he gets out of the car, he notices that there's something off and he quickly returns to his car, and he starts watching all the people outside the airport and in cars. He looks on top of a nearby building and notices Carl and his partners with binoculars. He realizes that Brenda definitely told them the plan, and he decides to drive off. Days later, Frank hosts a Pan-American Future Stewardess flight crew program, and he's able to get gorgeous women as his stewards. Meanwhile at the airport, Carl has asked for extra backup. Frank arrives at the airport with his gorgeous flight attendants, and everyone at the airport is taken aback by their beauty, even the extra backup that Carl called in. The flight attendants help draw attention away from Frank, and he's able to get on his airplane without any hassles. Carl gets a call that lets him know that there's a guy in a Pan American uniform, sitting in his car in front of the charter terminal. Carl and his whole extra security all rush towards the car, and when they see it's not Frank, he tells them that a man gave him his uniform and paid him $100 to pick someone up from the airport. Carl asks him who he's picking up, and his sign says Handretti, and right there Carl realizes that Frank outsmarted him again. He looks up and sees a plane leaving. I'm guessing weeks or months later, Carl goes to his boss to let him know that now Frank has changed his strategy, and he isn't making counterfeit checks, but he's now making real checks that are so perfect no one's noticed anything, and he's been using these checks in multiple different countries. He visits a place where checks are made, and they tell him that Frank's work is remarkable and must be using a special machine that prints real checks, and this machine can only be found in Germany, Great Britain, and France. Carl remembers that Paula told them she's from a small village in France, and assumes Frank must be there. They travel to Mont-Richard, France, and lo and behold, Frank is there printing out his thousands in checks. Frank tells Carl Merry Christmas, and he says how crazy is it that they're always talking on Christmas. Carl offers Frank handcuffs and advises him to surrender peacefully, because if he doesn't surrender, the place will be filled with 24 French police who won't take pity on him. At first he thinks that Carl is bluffing and no one's coming after him, but decides to trust him. When they get outside, there's no police, and he congratulates Carl on finally fooling him, but just seconds after saying this, the French police arrive and he's arrested. Carl tells him that he's going to get him extradited back to the US. We're now taken a few months into the year when Frank has served a few months in the French prison, and is now being extradited to the US. Carl breaks the news to Frank that his father passed away when he fell down the stairs at the Grand Central Station trying to catch a train and broke his neck. Grief-stricken, he goes to the bathroom to feel his emotions freely. Minutes later, a flight attendant tells Carl that everyone needs to be seated as they're approaching the US. Then when they try getting Frank out of the bathroom, they break down the door and find that he's escaped into the toilet. Frank runs away and reaches his mom's house, where he finds out that her and Jack Barnes have a daughter. The police show up, and he surrenders. Frank is charged as an adult and is sentenced to 12 years in Atlanta's maximum prison. He's told that he'll have to serve all 12 of those years in a maximum prison. Kind of crazy when you think how most murderers and rapists are given 15 to 20 years, but are eligible for parole after 4 or 5 years. Carl visits Frank occasionally, and on one visit he shows him a fraudulent check from a case he is working on. Frank immediately figures out that the bank teller was involved in the fraud. Shocked and impressed, Carl convinces the FBI to allow him to serve the remainder of his sentence working for the FBI Financial Crimes Unit, and he agrees to work for them. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Catch Me If You Can. Thanks for watching.